Why not literature in composition classroom? Why not biology texts in a composition classroom? Why not economics texts or anthropology texts? There's nothing inherently good or bad about using literature texts in a writing class. Any text can be used by an imaginative teacher to teach whatever it is he or she wants to teach. But literature texts are probably overused, and I think that they can perpetuate a romantic view of writing. So if I were going to use any texts, published texts, as models, I would much rather look to, say, Wired magazine. I prefer Wired magazine for text.
There's some really good pragmatic reasons for not doing this, and there's also some really good historical reasons for not teaching literature in the classroom. That's not to say that it couldn't work out well, and in fact I've heard of some really good examples of people using literature in the classroom to teach writing. So an example of this would be somebody who would look at the manuscripts of a writer, say George Orwell, like 1984, and compare drafts to talk about revision. Take a look at the way that he made changes from an original draft to a later draft and talk about why he made those changes, what the effects of the changes were, and how that impacted the overall piece that he was creating. So that's one way that you could use literature in the classroom effectively. Another way that I heard of, a friend of mine created a course where they studied transcendentalist writers like Whitman and Emerson and Thoreau and things like that, and then he had his students go out into nature and write about the same sorts of things that those writers were writing about at that time. So two ways. I mean, that's to say you can use literature in the classroom in ways that are effective. However, the problem with using literature in the classroom is that it often turns into a literature course. That's the thing you got to be careful about. You got to make sure that literature isn't the focus of the classroom. You want to make sure that you're talking about writing, focusing on writing. And when you bring literature into the classroom, a lot of times that's what happens. You focus more on the critical reading than you do on the writing aspect. So that's a really good pragmatic reason why not to do it. It's because you a lot of times you'll fall into that trap. And historically, this is one of the reasons why people avoid it, because typically writing programs are housed in English departments, and so historically you'd have people who studied literature their entire lives and were interested in teaching literature, and they were forced into what they would call kind of like a service course or something they didn't want to teach in like a first year writing class. And so they would use it to teach their pet projects, the literature that they like to read, the novels that they like to read, and they would turn it into a literature course. So this is something that we try to avoid as writing teachers. We try and make sure that we're not focusing on literature. Instead, we are focusing on writing. We're making sure that that's the main part of the writing course that we're working on.
Teaching writing, I certainly wouldn't use literature as a topic. For instance, I wouldn't teach Romeo and Juliet and ask kids to write about whether or not children should choose their own mates or something like that, or whether the play works in a certain way. But I might very well talk about that Shakespeare and his fellow writers constantly revise the plays and constantly work together to write the plays, that no one of those plays was ever written by one person, that they were written by a writing group working together. So I certainly do use literature to teach writing, in the sense that I use those revised works and I use those of models of not a way a writer should write, but a way a writer does write.
One of the issues I want to address is why we don't use literature in the composition classroom. We have historically at our university done that since the university was founded in the 1960s. But recently we have adapted and adopted the WAC philosophy for our campus. What that means to the composition program is that we are no longer training students to become writers in literature classes, but writers in all classes. So to teach writing with literature is to limit what our students are exposed to when they leave the composition classroom. They might be ready to write in literature classes, but they aren't ready to write in political science or biology. So we have restructured that component in our course, Composition 2 specifically, to include a focus on argumentation in a wide variety of topics that include international perspectives, pop culture, science and society, for instance. And while we value the use of literature in our literature survey classes, and we still believe it's a vital part of a well-rounded education in college, we understand and believe that writing needs to have a broader impact in the composition sequence.
Well, I would say the short answer to that question is because it's a writing classroom. It's a composition classroom. It's not a literature classroom. Students have lots and lots and lots of opportunities to read, critically analyze, respond to literature in classes that aren't writing classrooms. But they don't have very many opportunities to really focus on writing and learning how to write in many classes except the writing classroom. So I would say if students are going to read for a writing class, if you really want them to read for a writing class, which isn't a bad idea, but they should be reading about writing or about writers or reading the kinds of texts that they're interested in generating themselves. And when I say reading about writers, I mean I'm talking about things that maybe things that writers have written. I've used even Stephen King's work about writing, which I've forgotten, Stephen King on Writing, I think it's called, and things like that in some advanced composition classrooms. But basically in the writing classroom, I think that they need to be thinking and writing and thinking about writing. Appleby and Langer had an article in the most recent English journal where they went back and redid a study that they'd done years ago about the state of writing in high schools. And what they discovered is there's still not a lot of writing going on in high schools. So students aren't coming to us in college with as much experience with writing as we'd like them to have.
Well, I don't believe that we should use literature in the composition classroom because the composition classroom should specify non-fiction writing, whether that is essay writing, journaling, writing journalistic pieces for magazines. I would even go as far as to say newspaper. But we're not writing poetry, we're not writing fiction, and we're not writing drama. And so the study of those pieces, while it can be useful in terms of gaining information about how to use description or different kinds of techniques, really doesn't do the job that we're trying to accomplish, which is to teach students how to make arguments and support those arguments with facts and reasons using their best writing.